Hopefully this works. Morning, everyone. I love the girls. Morning to the shades. Ah, dear, I love it. Transfiguration. Jesus took Peter, James and John up a mountain. Now, I walked Snowdon many, many years ago, and it nearly hospitalised me. I mean, now Amanda was with us then, and she was, with the walking sticks, you usually walk with them. And it's like, get up, Bess, get up. It was a long way. And then I suddenly realised how unfit I was. So when you talk about James, Peter going up the mountain with Jesus, there is a long way. There is a purpose to all of this. See, in the Bible, mountains are always synonymous with majesty, dominion of God. Moses went up, got the 10 Commandments out of Sinai. Abraham took Isaac up to sacrifice him to the Lord. Elijah beat the priests of Baal up Mount Moriah. Carmel, sorry. He had the temple built on the mountain of Zion. Jesus was crucified on the Mount Calvary, and he ascended from the Mount of Olives. So there's a lot going on with mountains. Now, sometimes people do pilgrimages up mountains. I don't know if you've been to India. My man, many, many years ago, went for Menkap and did a walk for Menkap in the mountains of Himalayas. And there's loads of people would go up the mountains, make pilgrimages up mountains to be closer to God. But the thing is that for us, it's not an easy thing to do. We don't have many mountains in this place. For you to cart yourself off, even up to a very high point, takes time. We lead busy lives. How many times have we positive reinforcement for being responsible, predictable? Now you've got mobile phones, being easy to get hold of. We've got this little voice inside of us saying how important we are. The world might fall apart if we, go away for any length of time. It needs to be run smoothly. So Jesus took Peter, James and John up the mountain to pray. And as he prayed, his appearance was changed. In verse 29 it says, his clothing became white and dazzling. Clearly he was bathed in the light of God's presence. Same with Moses, as we heard from Corinthians. He said he was bathed in God's presence when he went up Mount Sinai. When he came down, because he spent so much time in the presence of God, his face shone brightly. So that's why sometimes he covered it with a veil. It's so apparent with Jesus that those who have been in the presence of God shine with God's glory. In religious art, I don't know if you've ever seen it, that in old paintings, saints was sometimes depicted with a halo on the back of the head, usually like a little disc or a plate or whatever. And it's meant to represent their holiness. And it reveals a quality sometimes we tend to overlook. Those who walk with God glow with God's radiance or his presence. Daniel 12 it says, those who are wise will shine as the brightness of the expanse, and those who turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Matthew 13 says, and the righteous will shine forth like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. Through Scripture, light is synonymous or a symbol of God. And whenever we come into the presence of God, we're filled with his light and God's love. And sometimes, like a living prism, we radiate and we reflect and refract that love and to shine that with God's love and light into others. Sometimes when I'm thinking about my talks, I sit in our lounge and I look through our French windows into the garden. Yesterday morning was a brilliant sunshine, and I looked at the windows, and Amanda looked at God's glory, and Amanda whispered to me, windows could do with clean. But the thing is this, when we look in the mirror, do we see the radiance of God sparkling in our eyes when I look at it? Do you know some people, when they walk into a room, the room lights up? Some people are like that, naturally. Sometimes, I was reading an article from the Church Times, and they said, they have various people, vicars and curates and whatnot, come in for interviews and stuff, and they said there was one particular person that came into the room, and as soon as they walked into the room suddenly lit up. They didn't need to ask that person any questions, said that person's got the Spirit of God. The closer we walk with God, the brighter our path will be. And same Jesus. Jesus prayed. I mean, this is the Son of Man. This is God's Son. The Trinity, the most complicated thing ever. And I'm like, why does he need to pray? In this passage, Jesus prays. His appearance became dazzling white. And he was joined by Moses and Elijah. Now Moses, in this instance, as you heard from Corinthians, represented the old law and the old way of thinking from the Old Testament. And Elijah represented the prophets. And a cloud covered the mountain, and the cloud came, and a voice said, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And yet, I got halfway through this talk and I thought, it's often tempting to talk about mountaintop experiences with God. How many of us hope to have regular mountaintop experiences with God? In a dramatic thunder and lightning way. Some Christians, some people I've spoken to have never, ever, ever had that mountaintop experience with God. And they wish for a dramatic experience with God. I wonder why they're always disappointed. Dramatic encounters with God are really, really rare. Even for Peter, these flashes of God's glory throughout the Bible are rare for both the extraordinary and the ordinary people. So I sometimes thought, well, I don't think the story of the Transfiguration is there to tell we can have a mountaintop experience. I think it's there to tell us, to reveal to us who Jesus really is. Jesus takes Peter, James and John with him, and incredibly, as the passage says, they're heavy with sleep when they get to the mountaintop. I know how they feel, because when I got to the top of the mountaintop, I need to have a little bit of a lie down. But can you think of another occasion when Peter, James and John pray with Jesus and they fall asleep? Garden of Gethsemane. I think it sometimes shows the disciples' inability to really understand and comprehend who Jesus really is. You see, on that mountaintop, the divinity, the actual being of Christ is revealed to them, and they are woken up by a flashing light. In the original translation, that uses the word dazzling, is actually the same word as they use for lightning. So the disciples are woken from their ignorance by the lightning of Jesus. Now, lightning is pretty powerful. For those of you who really want to go back to school, it's the average lightning bolt contains about 300 million volts. And a temperature which is about 20,000 degrees C, which is about 5 times hotter than the sun. So anybody that manages to radiate that much light and power is quite powerful and is quite bright. And yet we're told for a time from the passage that the disciples were sleepy. And it took a bit for them to even fully wake up. And even then, probably when you wake up and see something like that, you think, am I still asleep? What's going on? But how can anybody be drowsy in front of all of that going on, that spectacle? In the Garden of Gethsemane, we talk about how the humanity of Christ is fully revealed and that they're woken by Jesus to see him going to his death. The fact that on both occasions, they speak of them, the difficulty of really comprehending who Jesus really is the God, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, this deep mystery of our faith, the heart of our faith. A friend of mine, Steve Lee, wrote this: faith is not the same as belief or trust. Faith is both of these things put into action. Becoming a Christian is a step of faith. It's a step of faith to believe in a God you can't see. Most of us are more comfortable putting our faith in what we can see rather than what we can't. We tend to find our identity and confidence in our friends and those around us, but the problem is people can let us down, and sometimes the unpredictable can happen. Now's the time for us to really put our trust and faith in the right place. So we get to the part of the passage where it says, James and John and Peter wake up from their sleep. That's how I discern that there are two great figures of Judaism there, Moses and Elijah. Now, I don't know about you, how do they know? How do they know that this is Moses and Elijah? Because it's great if it's a representation of what the point of the exercise is. Moses represents the old law and the old covenant, and Elijah represents the old prophetic voice of God, continued to speak and minister into the Old Testament, to the old world. But it doesn't appear as these two guys are actually talking and reflecting on the ins and outs of law and the prophets. Instead, we're told they discussed Jesus' departure. That's why they were there. They've come to point Jesus in the direction he needs to go and encourage him down the path that lies to the salvation of the world. Now, I love Peter. I love the character of Peter in the Bible. How many times does he really spiritually put his foot in his mouth? So Peter is seeing this great, glorious event in front of him, and he decides he must do something. So what does he do? He decides to build 3 tents. Now, the text says he didn't know what he was saying. That's why I love Peter. Sometimes I'm exactly the same. You look at this and go, blah, 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 let's build 3 tents. You see, well, perhaps he was trying to preserve what he could see, what was going on, in the way we might try and do a bit of a photo, selfie or whatever nowadays. Perhaps he was trying to be religious, showing how he wanted to worship, to preserve the moment. So how can it be, following one of the most dazzling spiritual visual spectacles that ever took place in the planet, that God says, listen to him? Not look, not watch, listen. It reminds me of the first miracle. Mary says to the people around her, do what he says. Listen to him. Why go through all of that razzle-dazzle, the lightning, the thunder, all of that, and it's more about our ears than our eyes? So often we read incidents like this in the Bible and assume that if such a thing would happen today, it would change the world we live in and shake everything up. But in this case, this stunning spectacle is well out of the way of the public eye. Because there's only Peter, James, John and Jesus. He didn't take all of the disciples, he didn't take an entire village up there, Jesus took 3 people. And even for those human eyes, there was a mixture of confusion, sleepiness, and then they were quite reserved about talking about what they saw. The truth is, they didn't need to see Jesus visibly glow to display his glory. His glory has always shone for those with eyes to see. Just as brightly as when he talked to lonely prostitutes and outcasts, when he saved wayward tax collectors and offered forgiveness to those who had never heard a forgiving syllable in their lives. The glory of him, of Jesus, is here today, if only we just don't try and sleep through it. And if we find that the disciples kept quiet about this, then perhaps we can have a think about ourselves to wonder how often we keep silent about the great and glorious truths of the gospel. And we celebrate in church on Sundays, and yet we really fail to mention it during the week. And if it seems odd, finally, that the Father follows this up with a visual display and advises us to just listen and not look. Maybe because we are often fixated on the outward fame of the world and all these things that maybe gets in the way of our truly listening to what Jesus says. Peter, James and John were given a revelation of who Jesus really is. And we can quite clearly see that Jesus is on a level with God himself. He's not a good teacher, he is God incarnate. This Wednesday, as we've heard, is Ash Wednesday. And just to remind you, eggs, flour, lemon juice. For Shrove Tuesday, right? Pancake Day. Just remember that. Some people go, oh yeah. But like the new year, when we talk about Lent, it's about new beginnings, okay? Sometimes we can have plans and goals. We determine that this Lent will be the best Lent ever. You know, maybe you've planned never to raise your voice with your kids or your other half. Some of you are already laughing. You're not going to get impatient on the commute to work. You're not have a single negative thought about an annoying co-worker or a student or a classmate. You're not going to procrastinate at all during this time of Lent. This Lent is you're going to ready to become the saint you were called to be. You've got 40 days. It's all got to be done by Easter Sunday, by the way, too. And then perhaps life just gets in the way. You may have found that it's difficult to stay committed to your Lent practices that you expected. You notice you haven't stayed true to this year's, your commitments, or maybe you've forgotten some of the things you wanted to do, and you just, why bother? I failed at doing that as well. You're not alone. I've done a few Lents in my time. You know, giving up my favourite food, trying not to listen too much in the car and pray in the car on the way to work. You can get too much to try and do everything and keep forgetting them. Ultimately, you forget the real purpose of what it actually tries to do with them in the first place. So why not try something different? This year, for Lent, I'm doing nothing. This Lent, I want you to do nothing. I want you to be still, to sit and do nothing. Rather than do a million things, focus on being. It can be really challenging. What we consider doing nothing can actually be creating a space for God and allowing Him to do something within us. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon the Bible study groups. I'm not saying, we've got a book to read and all of that good stuff. What I'm trying to say is that it's less about the things we do or more about what God can do in us. All of my doing was getting in the way of actually being with God. Lent is here for us and our relationship with God. But remember, this is God's work. He is the one who will ultimately do it in us. So let's see what happens if you stop, let go, and truly allow God to work in us. And then perhaps, just perhaps, the light of God can shine a little brighter through us. Amen.